Irwin from Incourage, and I'd like to welcome you to the Form 990 and Foundation Fundamentals Workshop today. We are excited to present this workshop in partnership with the Counsel on Foundations, which we will tell you more about in just a moment. Incourage has been offering nonprofit trainings for the last 17 years around such topics as trusteeship, board governance, Form 990. We've done a series on financial workshops, and we're very excited to be able to offer today's workshop on how to read Form 990, how to understand the information that it provides about an organization, and share information about different types of foundations, as well as learn about best practices in philanthropy. We're also excited to share today's workshop not only with our community, but we are also very happy to have several of our other community foundation representatives with us. And you can just wave. You don't have to stand up if you don't want, but we do have representatives here today from Marshfield, Marinette, and Madison. And we want to thank you for being here today. And then also with us today is Kathy Krieger from Whitley, a tax audit and accounting service that serves a number of nonprofits and foundations in the state of Wisconsin, as well as locally here in Wisconsin Rapids. And we're also very pleased to have with us today Melissa Schultz of Schultz Nonprofit Law from Madison. And lastly, as many of you who have attended our public meetings previously, you know that we use the norms, and the norms are consistent practice that identifies behavior to ensure that we have civil and respectful conversations. And we found these to be very effective with the sessions that we've had previously. And so they're located on each of the tables, and I know you can read, but I'll just review them quickly. Be inclusive, everyone's voice is heard. Encourage open, honest, and directed conversations. Understand everyone has expertise. And be respectful and ask clarifying questions when necessary. So with that, I think we're ready to begin, and I'd like to turn it over to Christopher Gash, our Encourage Board Chair, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Dawn. On behalf of Incourage, I would like to again welcome you all to today's session and workshop. It really is wonderful to see such interest locally and regionally in this topic, and to welcome others from around the state here to our beautiful community. We're thrilled to be partnering with the Counsel on Foundations to present this workshop today. And the Counsel, for those of you that might not be familiar, the Counsel on Foundations is a national membership organization for foundations. So its members consist of community, private, family, corporate, healthcare conversion foundations from across the country and across the world. The Counsel does provide technical assistance, research, policy advocacy, legal expertise, professional development, and a host of other resources to its members. And today we are very fortunate to be joined by the Counsel's Senior Counsel for Compliance and Policy, Lara Kalwinski. In addition to Senior Counsel, Lara is also the Executive Director for the National Standards for U.S. Community Foundations Accreditation Program. She brings nearly a decade of exempt organization legal expertise to the Counsel, including experience working at both a healthcare conversion foundation as well as a community foundation in Indiana. Lara graduated from Indiana University with a JD and an MPA, and has experience working for foundations and nonprofit organizations in the U.S., India, Germany, Mexico, Liberia, Ghana, and now Wisconsin Rapids. She has trained nonprofit staff and boards on exempt organizations compliance, grant writing, management, board governance, and fundraising as well. So please join me in welcoming Lara Kalwinski.
Good morning. As Christopher mentioned, I'm Lara Kalwinski, and I'm here with you today to talk a little bit about foundations and the nonprofit sector, and hopefully to answer some of your questions. Well, I know that Christopher talked a little bit about my background. I do like to spend a few minutes talking about the work that I've done because I want you to trust the conversation that we'll be having today. So I am a product of a community foundation. I received a college scholarship called the Lilly Endowment Community Scholarship from a community foundation in my hometown, and later received internships and my first job out of law school through them before working for them as their vice president. So if I sound passionate about the work today, it's because I really love the foundation field. I love the work of community philanthropy. But as a lawyer, I'm someone who believes that loving the work means doing good work well. So I just wanted you to know a little bit about me, and as I put up the fun disclaimer up, I'm still going to talk a little bit about why I love Wisconsin. So while I may be from Indiana, just over the border, I have spent a lot of my childhood and adulthood here in Wisconsin. Wisconsin Dells is where I went on my first family vacation with a friend, where they get to bring a friend along, and they picked me. I did cross country. Our week of extreme training in high school was at the Dells, where we did 3-a-days and then played around in the pools and then went to the buffets and ate them out of pizza. You know, your state has a great tradition of Polish people. In fact, being up here in the Rapids reminds me a lot of where my family's from in Ostrzeżów, Poland. So it's really homey here, and I just have a sweet spot and a spot in my heart for supper clubs and brandy old fashions. So I'm really, this is not me putting on airs. I really love being here in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin Rapids especially. I got to experience Marjorie's last night, the most lovely people, from our server to the owners, and I got to experience your healthcare this morning. As you can hear, I'm a little stuffy, and I have to say I'm very impressed with Wisconsin Rapids healthcare. I was in and out in 30 minutes. I couldn't even get paperwork filled out in 30 minutes in Washington, D.C. So you also have extremely fast internet, and I just want you to know it is faster than what I have in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else I've traveled. And so if you can't tell, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm thrilled that you gave me an excuse to come to Wisconsin. That said, I want to remind everyone that I am a lawyer, but I am no one's lawyer in the room. I'm sure the other lawyers in the room will appreciate this. I'm here to provide information. Nothing here today establishes attorney-client relationships, and none of this is legal advice to be relied on. This is an information sharing, and again, I can see some of the lawyers smiling in the audience, but I always make sure we get this in, and it'll be there again, and I like to do that for emphasis. So a little bit about today's roadmap. I am somebody, if I'm going to be in a room for 2 hours, it doesn't matter how much pizza or coffee you give me. I need to know when the breaks are and what we're talking about, so that when I maybe start to need to take a walk or daze or something, I know that we might almost be into the next section. So while today we are going to talk a lot about the Form 990, I think it's really important to start a little bit with Foundations 101, partly because I think it answers a lot of the questions about the 990 as we talk through it. For those of you in the room who feel like that information is eye-rolling and stuff you already know, please be patient. What I find is that everyone's too afraid to say what level of comfort they have with the law and foundations. So if we all do this together, we're all in a learning space together, and we're kind of starting from the same place, even if we entered in different places. So from Foundations 101, we will go a little bit into the 990, and then if we have time, I have some information on grant agreements and conflicts of interest that I'd like to share with you as well. So getting into Philanthropy 101, for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk through, maybe 30 minutes so you can have a break. We're going to talk through an overview of the sector and take your questions. Okay, so the overview of the sector. I think what's interesting about philanthropy today is a lot of people talk about taxes and philanthropy, right, and giving. And actually, philanthropy and community development are so much, they existed so much before our tax system decided to give benefits or incentives to giving, right? Communities as far back as Pilgrims arriving or Native American groups in America came together, pooled funds and resources, and had redistribution opportunities for those resources. It wasn't until 1954 when Congress started to create structure around nonprofits, and then specifically in the late 60s around private foundations and public charities. And you'll see some of our earliest foundations in the United States. The Sage Foundation organized, Rockefeller organized, and our first community foundation was around for more than 100 years at this point. It started in 1914 in Cleveland. So don't ever let anyone tell you the flyover states don't do good stuff. I did not know that term until I moved to DC, and I'm very insulted by it. So, we do good stuff here in the Midwest. All right, so some of the notable achievements that foundations and philanthropy were at the core of. Some of you may know the 911 emergency system was actually started by a philanthropist who lost her husband due to an inability to connect to medical care quickly. The hospice movement, public libraries, I'm sure many people know about those. We actually have one in Whiting, Indiana, from the Carnegie family, I think. I know it's Carnegie or Rockefeller. Polio and yellow fever vaccines, and vaccines are still a huge part of international philanthropy. White lines on streets. Now, some of you may not like to stay in the lines, but those dotted white lines to help us not run into each other, part of philanthropy. And then, of course, research institutions, right? All of our universities have research wings, and or many of them. So the idea of doing research and moving science forward is all part of some of what philanthropy has been part of through the years. So, in the moments where we wonder what's philanthropy doing, or why don't we just have government and business, or can philanthropy do more? There is a history of not just doing the little things that your community feels, but also some pretty big things. So don't, think we're not busy. I think we're busy. The overview of the sector. I actually wanted to wait on this slide and ask anybody if you had an idea of how many foundations are in the United States, but I flipped slides. So we have 86,000 foundations in the United States. Now this lumps private and community foundations together, but I'd like to unlump them for a second. There's about 782 legally defined community foundations in the United States out of 86,000. So in those almost 800 communities, we have this really special opportunity for community development. And I include, some organizations that may not call themselves community foundations in that. Sometimes health conversions are seen in that bubble as well. But I just wanted to kind of give the idea of the subsets. And then foundations have 800 billion in assets and 50 billion in giving. Some of you in the room might be saying, if there's 800 billion in assets, why isn't there 800 billion in giving? Well, that's a question we actually get cyclically in the United States based on how investments are performing and how the economy is performing. The idea is that when people feel stretched, they say, why do endowments exist? Why is money being saved for the future when we feel so in need right now? Well, endowments exist, one, if you create something as endowment, your state laws make it a little bit difficult to unwind something from endowment, but it can be done. The other thing is, and when I talk to policymakers, I often use this example, a community foundation or a foundation with an endowment for a certain issue or geographic area is somewhat of a savings account for those communities, right? I'm a big fan of business and I'm a big fan of government, but I'm also a huge fan of nonprofits, and here's why. Government does what it has the public will to do. And that's the majority public will, not what I want, right, but the majority. Business does what it can profit from, as it should. I don't think either of those are negatives. Those are, in my framing, how these systems work. The charitable organizations try to do everything else. So when we look at healthcare, education, hunger, these are persistent, decades, centuries-old issues, and we're all trying to chip away at them because they're hard, and government doesn't have the public will, and business doesn't have a profit incentive. And again, that's okay. Things happen like that. But we're here now and in the long term to try to solve or lessen these issues in society. And so that's why you see a $50 billion giving in any given year and $800 billion in assets. Okay, so now chipping away at the charitable sector, and again, please be kind with me as I go through this. Some of you may already know this, but we're gonna, if I had this wall top to bottom, I might try to do a huge sort of flow chart of this information, but I don't think they'd want me to paint on the walls. So I'm going to try to go through this slide by slide. First, when we talk about the nonprofit sector or charity, we have to start thinking in two ways. First, there are charities as defined by the government, and then there is charitable works, right? People who maybe volunteer in their religious community, or people who say, I can't take it anymore, I'm just gonna go clean up the park because the weeds are making me crazy, and I'm one person and I'm not organized, or I might be myself and a few friends. An example I would give is I'm from a neighborhood called Hammond, Indiana, and I'm from a North Hammond part called Pulaski Park neighborhood. As I said, I have a Polish background. My family and some of my parents' friends decided they wanted to stay in their community while many others were leaving. And they wanted other people to stay, so they started cleaning up the little triangles of grass and the parks and trying to beautify the neighborhood that they loved and grew up in. That group started going to meet with the council person, and they were just a group of people. Then they became the Pulaski Park Neighborhood Association and incorporated as a 501c3, so they could get grants for that work. Eventually they remediated a brownfield, a small gas station in their community, and turned it into a park with a fountain. Then my father ran for councilman because they didn't feel the council person was responsive enough. So I'm trying to show how even when something isn't defined as a charity in the federal government, there is charitable works that are happening and sometimes become formalized charity and sometimes don't. So that's just a little bit to give you in a sense of, first we start with a word and then we get into the legalities at the federal and the state and local levels. So when we think about charities, we'd be thinking about foundations, human services organizations, civil rights organizations or social justice organizations, religious institutions, historical societies, and many others. When we think about non-charities but doing charitable work, I gave you an example, and there's some others listed. But does everyone feel comfortable starting with the idea that things can be charitable without being a 501c3 nonprofit? Okay. So when we get into actually being a formalized charity, it's important to know how the government defines charitable purpose. So organizations that have a charitable purpose are organized and operated exclusively for the following reasons, and I won't go through them. Many of you have probably heard it before. For exempt organization attorneys like myself, we tend to rattle off religious, charitable, so I won't do that to you, but you'll see it. So the important parts of once you're doing work that's defined as charitable are, in the government's eyes, no part of the net earnings of charitable work should inure private benefit. That may mean who you contract with at a charity. It may mean that You don't give out dividends, right? Like a company would give out dividends. People who make donations into a charity don't expect a return. I mean, they expect a social return, but not a check coming in the mail like dividends, so that's important. No substantial part of the activities is propaganda or influencing legislation. Now, community foundations and public charities have some lobbying exceptions to that. Private foundations do not. Participate or intervene in political campaigns. Again, I can get a lot more into lobbying and political activity. It's quite nuanced, but the generalized sense is that you're not existing only to influence elections or political environments or legislation. But again, community foundations and public charities can do some of that. So I don't want you to take that as an absolute no. That's not the majority of the work can be those things. Okay, defining charitable, because we all say, religious, charitable, but charitable is an amorphous word until the government tells us what they mean by it, right? So here's some examples of what the Department of Treasury would tell you charitable means. Relief of poor and distressed or the underprivileged, advancement of religion, education, or science, maintenance or erection of public buildings, monuments, and works, and promotion of social purposes such as lessening neighborhood tensions, eliminating prejudice and discrimination, defending human and civil rights as secured by law, and combating community deterioration or juvenile delinquency. The last one, which is actually the second to last, is lessening the burden of government. This is an interesting one that I actually work on quite a bit with the Treasury and the IRS, because more and more we are seeing foundations, particularly community foundations, pressed on by local municipalities to take part in economic development. And economic development is not per se charitable. It's not just charitable because it exists. You have to actually fit it into a 4-part test, and that test is quite vague. So I work with the Treasury quite a bit on examples from the field, anonymous, so they don't know where to go find them, about what people are doing within the test and whether it falls within or out, and how to get it to fall within. So I think this really helps us understand more about this word charitable, because this is kind of what's fun about the work I do. There are terms of art that we use in everyday conversations, and then there are terms of law. And sometimes a term like charitable is a term of art and a term of law, right? So the IRS, the Treasury, legislators define charitable in a specific way. When we all are having conversations about charitable works in our community, it might not be the same definition. Neither is wrong, but when you're communicating with the government, we mean something very specific. Okay, so being a charity. To be deemed charitable and to keep your status as charitable with the government, you have to carry out activities that further your mission. You have to have a mission that articulates a charitable purpose that we just talked about. You should not have shareholders or operations for the benefit of a single individual. There's many tests I can work with you on to determine if that's happening. You should not attempt to influence legislation, but there are many exceptions to that. So we always say that, and then we have to chip away at it very quickly, but it's there. And should not endorse or oppose a candidate for elected office. So now that we understand the idea of charitable as defined by the government, we're going to talk about charities and the different types. So being a charity, when we think about charities in the formal sense, in the government sense, there are two types: private foundations and public charities. And the IRS starts defaulting that everyone is a private foundation, and then you have to prove that you are a public charity, because a private foundation has less tax benefits and less incentives in the government system due to the ideas that there is more control by individuals in that situation than in a public charity. So everyone starts default when you come into the IRS. They're like, okay, if you're going to be a charity at all, you're starting as a private. Prove to me that you're not a private but actually a public. So this is what it looks like to try to figure out if you're a private foundation or a public charity. And the public charity piece, what really defines a public charity, which includes public foundations and community-based foundations, is the public support test. So with a private foundation, oftentimes the money is coming from one or a few individuals or a group, right? A family, a corporation, a group of individuals. With a public charity, you must pass a public support test, which means you must get, it's not a majority, it's not 50%, but you must get at least a third of your support from contributions from the general public. And that's really to say a public charity is representative of the public, not just in dollars, but hopefully in voices. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's why we differentiate these. Private foundations don't have a public support test. Public charities do. Private foundations get a lesser tax deduction. I think it's 35. Public charities get 50%. Okay, distinctions in private foundations. This is not community foundations, this is not public charities, this is private foundations. In private foundations, you have two types. You have operating and non-operating. So some private foundations are operating and they run programs as well as making grants. And some private foundations just make grants. One of the advantages of being a private foundation that makes grants is that you sometimes get that 50% tax deduction, depending on how you're spending the money and how quickly and what the project or program is. But generally, there's these two types. So if anyone ever says to you, oh, I know I'm on the board of an operating community foundation. Operating and non-operating are not words used in the public charity field because all public charities are operating. All are running programs and grant making for the most part. So then we have endowed or non-endowed foundations. So a non-endowed foundation means funds are coming in and funds are going out, and there's not as much of an interest or focus on longevity or the long term. An endowed foundation means that you don't spend the corpus, some portion of money put in, but that money gains interest and you use the interest for grant making, for programs, for operations. So and you can have an operating non-endowed or endowed, you can have a non-operating endowed or non-endowed, but these are two terms or two sets of terms that get thrown around a lot with foundations. And I wanted to clarify these are private foundation terms, and that when you hear them, especially operating or non-operating, you're thinking of private foundations. Endowed or non-endowed can also be other types of public charities, but we'll get to that in a minute. The three most common types of private foundations are family foundations, independent foundations, and corporate foundations. So family foundations are somewhat self-explanatory. The funds usually come from a family. Independent foundations often start as family foundations, and then once the heirs pass away or the heirs aren't interested in being part of it anymore, they become an independent foundation. So a great example is something like the Mott Foundation, right? The Mott Foundation is no longer family controlled. It is an independent foundation, but it was started by the family. A corporate foundation is one that corporations start. That's somewhat different than corporate responsibility programs within a corporation. We can talk about those later if we want to, but a corporate foundation is one set up by the corporation, separate from the corporation, but interested in corporate social initiatives. So again, going into our charts, when we think about public charities, there are many types of public charities, but the ones we're going to talk about today are community foundations and other. And the reason is community foundations, first, many people don't know that they are actually public charities and not a private foundation or some foundation type that would be defined in law not under public charity. So first, they're a public charity. And that means they represent the community, they have to pass the public support test, and they can run programs and do grant making, right? Not just that, they are both grant makers and fundraisers. And any foundation person, community foundation person I have in the room could tell you all about the pains of being both a fundraiser and a grant maker at the same time. I actually always wondered when I got into community foundation work, why didn't I just go to the private foundation side? You know, I didn't have to worry about the money part. Okay. But what I want to say here and emphasize is, just because I've taken a community foundation out of the public charities distinctions right now, I do want to emphasize that community foundations and public foundations can run programs as well as do fundraising, as well as do grant making, because they fall under public charity. Legal requirements for community foundations. This is where I'm going to get a little bit nerdy with you for a minute, if you didn't feel I was nerdy enough already. So, what does it mean to be a community foundation within a public charity, right? Within the definition of public charity. Well, that's defined in Treasury Reg 1.170A9F11. If you can't tell, I rattle that off a lot. So first, a community trust, and I'm calling it a community foundation here, has to have a common name. And the reason it has to have a common name is because community foundations originally started in Cleveland, but then moved quickly from dormant trusts sitting at banks. So you had dormant trusts at banks. The trustees at the banks were saying, what do we do? There's no one left to make decisions. What are we going to do with these funds? They're sitting. Those funds were transferred into community foundations with agreement by the state. And then a board that represented the diversity of the community would help make decisions about where those funds would go for the good of the community. And diversity of the community doesn't mean a number of board members. It doesn't mean board members have to come from different sections. It means you know your community. The community should be talking to you enough that you can represent the diversity of the community on your board. The next thing is, so the reason it has to have a common name is when you think of all those trusts going into one place, you didn't want them still being called trusts. You wanted them to be calling one thing under one organization running them, and that was the community foundation. So they have a common governing instruments, and those are your bylaws and your articles of incorporation, and those documents should be taken together as governing instruments. It's not one or the other, it's both. You have to have a common governing board. Again, there's not going to be, when you think of the original transfers, there's not trustees from every one of those dormant trusts that came in, mostly because there's not trustees anymore. There's one governing board, there's one governing instrument, there's one governing names, and it's emphasized because of how they started as fragmented pieces. Okay, and just 2 points on common governing board. Size of board is often determined at the state level. Most states say you have to have at least 3 board members. There's an association called ASAE, and they regularly put out information about size of boards. A trend a while ago was large boards. We're trending towards smaller boards. There's arguments on both sides. Larger boards, some people say there's more work you can get done in committee, and sometimes that's seen as a good thing. Smaller boards, less work gets done in committee, and then you don't have report outs from committees, you actually have the whole board informed of the work. Again, ASAE is a really great place to go for resources on that, but that's some of the general trends that we see in the field. Also, most states require at least 1 board meeting per year. So one of the questions you might want to ask a foundation when you're meeting with them is, how often does your board meet? You know, what do they find out when they talk? I don't know about you, but if I only talk to someone once a year, I forget things. So one of the things you want to know is, how often is the board communicating with one another and reporting and getting reports from staff? The next point of a community foundation is variance power. And variance power is really important. Does anyone know what it is? Variance power is a really core concept to community foundations, and actually one that I have to speak with legislators and the Treasury and the IRS about all the time, because they don't want community foundations getting away from this concept at all. Variance power means the community foundation has exclusive legal control over the funds that come in. That means, well, you make a contract with some donors when money comes in and that money is restricted. At the end of the day, if that restriction needs to be removed and the community foundation board thinks that restriction needs to be removed for the good of the community, They can work with your state charities officials to remove that restriction, or in some cases can remove the restriction by board vote. So one thing and this is, again, goes back to what were community foundations when they began. And this was the idea that there were all these trusts coming in that were supposed to be dormant, but if someone appeared and later made a claim, the system of community foundations creation wouldn't have worked. You had to make sure that once it went to the community foundation had exclusive legal control. Now, we started in 1914, we didn't get laws on 501c3s till 54. We didn't get more laws on public charities versus private foundations till tax reform in 1969. So now, variance power is critical to legislators and policymakers because of taxes. If a donor does not cut the strings of their contribution, they should not receive the charitable tax deduction for that contribution. And this is one of the IRS and Treasury's biggest issues. Advisory privilege exists with some funds like donor advice funds, right? But that's advisory, and the board gets to make the ultimate decision. And I spend 1 week a month at the Treasury explaining how community foundations understand this rule, implement this rule, make donors and communities aware of this rule, because there is not enough we can do to enforce this rule that will make Treasury and legislators happy, because they feel so strongly that donors should not receive that tax deduction if they have not cut the strings of that gift. So this is what I talk about all over the country. I'm on the road 100 days a year talking about this, and variance power is in every presentation I do. It's in every meeting I have with state and federal regulators. And I just, I'm probably pressing on this too hard, but I want to take a minute and really explain this is the number one thing I spend time on with regulators, and it's the number one thing as a executive director of an accreditation program that I spend time explaining and making people redraft documents to say, state your exclusive legal control. And I believe I have some accredited community foundations in the room. Do I? Did any of you get documentation back saying be clearer about your control? I think so. Okay. Trust me, I look at 510 of these applications, so we have a lot of them, and that's our number one issue. And it's my number one issue with legislators and policymakers. So Joint Committee on Taxation, Senator Chuck Grassley, Senator Paul Ryan, they're all asking me about that. Number one thing. Okay, I'll move on, but number one thing. The last two things of a community foundation, you must have reasonable return on investments. Reasonableness is always a fun word that the government gives us. That just you have to show that you've done due diligence, that you're meeting general market returns, although foundations have been given new rules as of last year that if you're investing in your community and in your mission, you do not have to always meet market returns. And that was a big move on their part to help community philanthropy invest in their communities and not think that they were going to be seen as doing an investment that was not prudent. So that was huge, and we'd been working with the Treasury and the IRS for a very long time on this issue, and they finally said, hey, we don't want to discourage community investment, and if that means changing this language, we will do that. If you all need the revenue rev proc on that, I can give it to you. The day it came out, I cheered a lot, and then I went to a meeting the next day and got to cheer with colleagues, and I carried it around with like highlighter for a week. I did a lot of work on that part, so I was really excited. Periodic financial reports. This is the idea that the board, which is a representative of the community, has an idea of what your balance sheets say and what's going on. And I will tell you, the number one non-compliance report I get at the National Standards Program is regarding how much the board knew about the financials and the decisions that were made by staff, and did the board know or not know. And in fact, right now, if you Google some newspapers in California, you'll see a lot of chatter about this exact issue. So I always want to remind people, no one person makes decisions at the community foundation, right? That would be improper. You have a governing board who's engaged and informed and is making decisions. the governing board is the ultimate controlling entity. If the charities officials from the state or the federal government come in and ask you questions, they're not going to say, what did the CEO know? They're not going to say, what did staff know? They're going to say, what did the board know? And how did they make decisions? So again, I'm pressing on the importance of the board and governing control. So why is this important? I think I hit on all of these in the last piece, so I won't spend too much time here. But again, you can see the reason component funds and the definition of community foundation are important is this idea of irrevocable transfers, no material restrictions or conditions on gifts after they're in, right? A donor can certainly name a fund. A donor can designate a fund or put a field of interest on it or a certain entity, but they can't keep messing with it after they sign the agreement over to you, right? That would be ongoing control or material restriction. If you have a question about material restrictions, I've given you the Treasury Reg citation. We always like to do that in case other people like me are nerds and want to go to the library after this. And then I did want to spend a minute on health conversion foundations because we're starting to see more of those in the community philanthropy world, and because I work for one, so why not talk about it? So health conversion foundations can take several different structures. They can be private foundations, public charities. The most important things to know is that when they're choosing a structure, they often do a community assessment or a needs assessment, much like the hospital was doing public benefit reports when they were a hospital, to determine the best way to move forward. So these are some of the things that you'll see your hospital conversion foundations thinking through as they decide their service to the community. So in a nutshell, if you all needed one slide for everything that...
Can you just back up for 1 second? Can you explain why a healthcare conversion foundation comes into existence, the sale?
Sure. So healthcare conversion foundations, I actually just reread this last night, with the IRS take a few forms. You may have a nonprofit hospital selling to a nonprofit hospital, and there may be spin-off assets that go into a hospital conversion. You may have a nonprofit hospital that's winding down and going out of business that may have assets left over that spin off into a foundation. Or you may have some other transaction between hospitals that result in a conversion into a health conversion foundation. So it's not just one thing. I actually wanted to spend more time on this for you all, but it gets to graduate level too quickly, even sometimes for the lawyers involved, because of the complexities of how these conversions occur. But the idea is if there's a change in a nonprofit hospital structure in the community, there may be assets that can be converted to a foundation that are seen as community assets because it was a nonprofit hospital. So those funds as a nonprofit kind of have to stay charitable funds. They can't take private status. And you have to figure out how to structure that best for the community that paid in by paying for services.
I'm Paula Christensen from the Veterinary Foundation. They just got accredited!
Did we? Good.
Oh yeah, I was telling Jenny, I was like, I have their accreditation packet, maybe I can hand deliver it to them. But they just got reaccredited with standards.
We're fairly unique.
Yes.
Besides just being special women, we cover all of Marinette County and all of Menominee County, Michigan.
Yes.
So we're physically in Michigan, in the city of Menominee, and we applied for a grant, received a grant from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund. Mm-hmm. Are they a health conversion fund? I've never heard that term.
Okay.
But I'm wondering if that's what they are.
Michigan does have several health conversion funds, and I've worked with them both with Counsel on Michigan Foundations and through the Counsel on Foundations, so it's very possible. I don't have them all memorized in the country, but it's possible. Do you gentlemen have a question?
I can't hear you when you're not at your
Oh, thank you for saying that. My apologies. Did you want me to repeat? Okay. Yes.
In that kind of transaction, does it always create a separate foundation, or would sometimes those assets go to a community foundation or some other kind of?
Sure. So actually, I dealt with this in the county next door to Lake County when I was at my community foundation called Legacy Foundation, which is funny, right? It's Lake County Community, but Lake County Community Foundation was already taken by Illinois, and Legacy seemed like what we were trying to leave the community, so that was the name of our foundation. Sorry. Side note, so when I was in Lake County, the county next door, Porter County, was going through a hospital conversion. And the community foundation was a serious option for the funds. The question becomes, in the case in Porter County, and not all cases are the same, the question became public officials being part of the hospital conversion board and what that meant for control of the community foundation. So they were, I'm not sure today if that structure has been decided. I left that community before the decision was made, but the community foundation was the early on choice for those funds. Again, they had some issues with who needed to be on the board of the hospital conversion by law as they worked with the state of Indiana, because most health conversions that I read about from the IRS, you have to check in with your state charities officials to kind of bless the conversion type that you choose. Sorry, I made a bless symbol, but there could be many types of blessed symbols in the world. All religions are great. I guess that's not a good statement either, just drop all of that. So the state often, and again, from the IRS's perspective, the state does need to be aware of the status chosen and why. So that sometimes comes into play. But in Porter County, there was some issue with public officials on a community board and what would that mean long term. Sorry that I don't know the conclusion of that one. Yes, sir.
Are these conversion foundations and their structure controlled individually by states, or are they federal?
So hospital conversions, like private foundations and public charities, are both controlled at the federal and the state level with certain laws. So at the state level, there's an association called the National Association of State Charities Officials, and it's called that because sometimes state charities officials are part of your attorneys general, and sometimes they are part of the Department of Agriculture or a different entity, so we can't just say National Association of Attorneys General in this case, but each state does have some entity that is looking at charities, organizations, and how they're following state and federal law. And in state law, one of the most common issues, or one of the most common areas that the state is checking charities on is UPMIFA, the Uniform Prudent, oh gosh, it's UPMIFA. I have a head cold. I'm gonna not try to tell you all those words, but I know them. Is that helpful?
Do you know what Wisconsin's rules are for health conversion foundations?
I don't off the top of my head, but if that's something you all would like me to research and send back, or to work with the woman here from Madison, I can certainly do that and provide that information after. Was that be helpful? Mm-hmm. All right, I commit to you to do that, and we'll share it, with everyone. But I will do some of that work. Yes.
I was going to say, if it's not, is it always a hospital? Because I think when Blue Cross Blue Shield in Milwaukee became a for-profit entity, a foundation was created out of the.
That's correct. So Blue Cross Blue Shield is a great example of a. So sometimes they are called hospital conversions, but lawyers will often call them healthcare conversions, right? So, and again, the idea is if you were a nonprofit providing health services, there's something called the Cypre doctrine at the state level. And the Cypre doctrine is if a nonprofit concludes its work as a nonprofit, that money has to stay in the nonprofit sector, and usually in the same type of entity. So if it was a public charity, it has to stay a public charity. If it was a private foundation, it may be able to be a private foundation or a public charity, but it's hard for a public charity to go private. I'm not going to say it can never happen, but that's, that is not something that we'd think about as much. So yeah, it's the idea that public monies or money from the community it went into a nonprofit, it has to stay in a nonprofit structure, hopefully in a similar purpose or in a similar community that it came from. Sir, yes.
In Wisconsin Rapids, the hospital, which was a nonprofit, was sold to a entity.
Yes.
How do we get information as to what that nonprofit is doing?
Sure.
Where is it published? Is it published in your 990?
Sure. So for an organization, a new organization to be created, something called a 1023 is filed with the federal government. The Form 1023 is what they do to decide what type of entity the government tells you that you are. So that nonprofit then gets a letter, or that entity, we don't know what it is yet, gets a letter that states what section of the code it is defined under. And if it's a community foundation, it's 170B1A6, right? But if it's a different organization, it will be a different number. Then, once that organization is found to be a certain type of organization with the federal government, they have to file annual Form 990s with the federal government, which we'll talk about next. And those 990s must be made available to the public, and GuideStar is not sufficient for public disclosure. So the actual entity needs to make those documents available to the public. I will actually, that's part of my next presentation. I don't want to not answer your question, I just don't want to give it away. Because then who's going to come back after our first break?
I just want to know where do I get this information?
Sure, that's all.
Is it a yearly?
It is. It's part 2. Stay tuned. You couldn't have done a better commercial for part 2. I really actually appreciate that. Okay, any other questions before we move on? I want to give you all a break in a few minutes. We're at slide 23. I'm going to slide 31. Okay. So again, this sort of summarizes what we talked about, so you have a nice plain language summary. Again, this is stripping away a lot of the tax language and coming back to, if I'm in a conversation with people, how on earth do I just talk about what this girl talked about for the last hour and bored me to death? Use this slide. It's slide 24. Okay, so what does it mean to be a foundation? I'm going to go a little bit into what does all this stuff mean. Common traits of foundations are grant making, convening, subject matter expertise, community issue area leadership, and oftentimes programs, right, based on all the knowledge and subject matter expertise and convening power that a foundation would have. And in fact, if you go through the National Standards Accreditation Program, we use a definition of community foundation that goes above and beyond the definition in law, and we say that you have to demonstrate community leadership. You have to demonstrate how you know your community and are responding to its needs. So if you have ever heard of a community indicators report or a vital signs report, part of the reason your community foundations are doing that is to demonstrate that they are doing this work. Okay, so this is oversimplified, but I wanted to give very easy structures to understand the basic structure of many private and community foundations. But please, please, if I hear anyone goes around saying this is the only way they can be structured, I'm going to come back and redact these slides. This is a general understanding. So private foundations, again, who's in control? Governing board. Who reports to the governing board? President or CEO. And then they might have finance, programs and grant making, operations, and marketing and communication. So again, very basic structure of what an organization could look like. When you look at a community foundation, you have those same pieces, and then you add in development and fundraising because you have to have public support. So again, do not hold me to these structures. This is a basic idea of saying board of directors on top, one different department in each. Again, if you go around town saying this is the only way, I'm redacting. Okay, so what does that mean for how a community foundation or community philanthropy or foundation shows up in your community? And what I find really interesting is I know that the UN goals might not seem like something that hits Wisconsin Rapids, right? But I would argue the UN actually does quite a bit of work on making sure these goals are applicable from Peru to England to Poland to Wisconsin Rapids and in the United States. These goals were looked at from the totality of what is our world facing in the next 20 or 50 years. The goals before the Sustainable Development Goals were called the Millennium Development Goals, so maybe some of you have heard of those. Now, there are currently 17 goals worldwide to make our communities better, safer, thriving places. And you can read all those, I won't go through them, but I did do a little test of how we're doing using Incourage's Form 990. So on Schedule O of the 990, and I know we're getting into the 990 and I said we wouldn't do that just yet, but we're here and we're talking about what foundations do, so I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit. I went into the Incourage Foundation's 990 and I looked at their Schedule O, which is a narrative place where you put down what you do for the community, and I found 4 things based on a community survey that Incourage wants to do based on what its residents told them. And I said these to someone earlier by memory, and I would like credit for that. I don't see him though. Yeah, I don't see him. He was across the street. Okay, so I'll try to do them from memory now. A strong economy, opportunities for youth and adults, openness to change, and nature that people can use, sort of. Focus on nature and recreation. Okay, but I promise I really do read 990s a lot, all day long. So these are the 4 things that Incourage heard from your community that they want. And I mapped them, and they meet all 17 of these goals. And I showed you how. So when we don't think international frameworks apply to us, sometimes they do. And I think this is a good example, and I hope that they're okay that I did this, because I didn't tell them. But I thought we could demonstrate impact for community development is really difficult to explain. You saw how hard it was just to explain the structure. Now imagine trying to explain what you do with that structure. It gets really hairy and too long, right? Sometimes I hear from community foundation boards, just tell me how to talk about ourselves, it's hard. The reason it's hard is community foundations and community philanthropy is general because it applies to the community, right? So it's general because it applies to anything the community needs, and it's specific because it's specific to a community. But that doesn't help us get anything done unless we can work with others, both in the community and outside, to move forward on some of these issues. And I'm excited to see that your community echoes the world community, because you can chip away at this together. So sorry if that's too Pollyanna-ish, but that's who I am. Okay, also I looked into, okay, so they say these are their four ideas from the community. What are they doing to do these things, right? Because the next step of having sustainable development goals or having community goals is doing something to make the goals happen, to achieve the goals. Feels so fun talking about goals and achievements when the Olympics are happening. Okay, so also on their Schedule O, I found some information about how the community survey is put into action with Incourage. So they have a regional economic growth initiative, and that seems to go to the economic issues we talked about on the last page. They have a digital access and digital literacy, and that seems to go to both the number 2 and the number 3 pieces of the community survey. They do the community framework that integrates grants, programs, and initiatives all together. That to me seems like openness to new ideas and changes. They have a vital signs report. I don't think you can do any of these things without those reports telling you what the community actually needs. They have critical community conversations, right? And that goes to, again, what do all of these things need to be informed by? Community dialogue. They have development of a tribune building, which goes to probably strong economies, but I could imagine it goes to 2, 3, and 4 as well, depending on what you all are doing with that. And then they have impact investing, the idea that not just their grant money goes to the benefit of the community, but their invested funds, their program funds, the employees' work, and the grants all go to the mission of the foundation. And that's unique because not all foundations use all assets and all resources for mission. Sometimes investments are what's going to make the biggest return, and that's mission because then we have more money. But there's other ways to look at how to invest your money, and sometimes that's community. So I see them mapping pretty well when I have to interpret the 990. And you all can go through that exercise with your own organizations or not. Maybe I was just bored on a plane, but I thought that was pretty fun. Okay, so this is the point where we're going to take a little break.